Hey guys, welcome back to Proper Chuffed. My name is Hilton and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. But that is half of the fun of this, isn't it? Today I've got something a little bit different for you guys and perhaps a little bit long. So do grab a cup of tea or a dram of whiskey, I won't judge, because we're going to make some mountains. Now, a small disclaimer, unfortunately I did lose a little bit of footage along the way in producing this video. So sadly I've had to jump in time in one of the sections, but I do apologize for that. Regardless, this is a slightly chaotic video and I hope you can sort of understand the method to my madness in all of this. There's no right way to do landscaping when you're modeling. I think the few things I consider when I'm doing this is it light? Is it durable? And does it look good? And I think that all three of those criteria have been met in the production of my West Highland mountains. Now, these are by no means gigantic structures, but they are rather large and require some fairly difficult maneuvering as I build them. Still, I hope you're able to pull something from this chaotic mess to inspire you when you do your landscaping. Let's get straight into it. All right, so today we're going to make some mountains. And frankly, you're probably gonna notice changes of shirts over time because this isn't gonna be done in a day, unfortunately. So the idea is that I'm going to use these polystyrene boards to create a sort of outline or silhouette and main structure for the mountains. I'm going to essentially mark off exactly what I want in terms of the landscape shape, and I'm going to create various different versions of that, and we're going to use that as the base support or structure for the mountain. We'll then fill in the gaps between the mountains using paper and a mix of foam and different elements and seal it all up and then be able to plaster it, which will look really great. I've not actually used this method before, but one of my favorite hobby YouTubers, Boylai Hobby Time, once built a rather large mountain. It's massive, using this method. And I think that it looked pretty rigid and solid overall. And it's something that I wanted to try out for myself. So I suppose let's give it a bang, shall we? Hello. One of the reasons why I kept this hole in this section was specifically so that I could do this part, which is to make the mountains on this side of the layout. Now these mountains are going to be rather large on actually both sides, but this will be the first side I work on. I'll probably do the other one off camera. If this method works, then hopefully I can just sort of replicate it on the other side. With the layout here sort of ending, I'm planning on adding a small sort of 5 centimeter gap to this area here, extending it a little bit so that the scenic boards have a little bit of extra room to breathe. The thinking there is that the mountain needs to sort of curve further down. Now I'm going to work on that when I actually move the entire layout a little bit away from the wall and add in that backstop, so to speak. But for now, I can get the main structure of the mountain out of the way and then just sort of blend it in on the other side at a later point. I'm not too worried about this side, to be honest with you, because it's not something that's going to be visible anyways from that perspective. So I'm not too worried about sort of rounding it off on that side. But the important part is to get the structure here of this mountain. Okay, so I have my board here, and the idea is that I'm just going to kind of mark out exactly where this mountainscape goes. So the idea is going to be to just kind of mark off exactly where this mountain, I sort of want to peak up here. And then I'd like it to dip down and then maybe peak a little bit again and then start dropping. Kind of gives me a rough idea. In fact, I think I might go a little bit more severe. Just something a little bit more aggressive. The idea will be to cut and open this up and cut out that exact shape. So let me show you what I do next.
I'm hoping you can hear me kind of in a way. This is the Woodland Scenics wire cutter, and it uses a sort of pulse function. It heats up the wire and then it cools it down. So you can't do one quick go of when you're cutting. You have to kind of wait as it sort of heats up, cools down, heats up, cools down, as you make your way through, which is probably better because it helps you line things up a little bit more for the next time that you get the pulse and it heats up. Anyways, let's give this a go.
You're probably wondering why I didn't just use the knife in the first place. Well, it's because it helps me get a much cleaner line and reduces the amount of little bits of foam that fly around everywhere. That's actually why I use the wire cutter where I can. Okay, so there we have an outline, something of an outline of our first section. So that will go against the wall and be our base support, essentially. It looks a bit odd, I realize, but it'll start making sense while we've got a few of them. So I'm going to do those in the background and we'll come back to when they're all done. You can kind of see where I'm going with this. Now you see that side over there, there's kind of like a gap. That's exactly where the tunnel portal is, so I'll just trim that off on the end there. But I'm kind of getting a rough idea of how this mountain comes down from the Highlands, and it basically gives us the rough structure we need to put this all together. So I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to let this dry now, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so I've now got basically all the paper inside the mountain, but I realized that it's probably the best time now to actually finish off the shape of the mountain before I seal that section up with plaster of Paris, because I just think it would make a little bit more sense not having it halfway done, rather go all the way down the mountain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start rounding this off. I'm going to use these cut off pieces that I have and just continue the sort of shape of the mountain down. Now, the idea down in this section is that this is a bit of a cutaway in the railway line. Obviously, there's a lot of these in Scotland, a lot of open cutaways, and that's my intention here. I kind of want to have the mountain flow down and then have the cutaway, and then it continues sort of off the baseboard. So it looks like that rock has been blasted away. I'll be able to detail all that once I get to that point. But the point is now I need to just make sure that I have the space for the cutaway and to continue that shape of the mountain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut up these extra bits that I have and extend these as much as I can to kind of bring down the shape of the mountain. And then when we get to this section here, I'm going to have to cut some new shapes of foam just to make that cut off. So we're going to do that right now. I've actually realized I don't need to use the wire cutter with this type of polystyrene because it actually doesn't make that much of a mess if I cut it with a knife. So it's a pretty dense polystyrene. It's not like the sort of cheap stuff you usually get with packaging. It's a little bit more dense, and as such when you cut it, it cuts fairly cleanly, so it's not too messy, and I don't really need to use the wire cutter as much as I initially thought I did. So that's pretty cool. Honestly, it really helps to keep offcuts or stuff from boxing if you're doing a layout. And in the past couple of months, we've ordered like a new fridge and all sorts of stuff. And actually, look at that. That's perfect. So I'm going to cut this open just to the shape. It helps to keep, losing track of my point. You can really use it to sort of bolster up landscapes and stuff when you're doing something like this. Not every single piece is going to work entirely well, but you can certainly cut it to shape and bolster up your landscape if you have the option to do so. So this works out nicely. I'm just going to kind of position this as best I can and work out where exactly I need to cut it. Okay, cool. So you can actually see that fits quite nicely there. I can really just now glue this down, and it sort of provides a bit more of an even ground so that when I do this piece here, we've got something to stand on. I'm going to have to just trim that off a little bit there, just to that corner so that it's a bit more flat when I put down this piece. But that should give us a nice little lead off and run off on the mountain. And I can obviously just then, if necessary, trim this section down here just to make sure that the sort of slope down becomes a little bit more shallow, so to speak. So that I think will work quite nicely. So I'm just going to glue this down. All right, so we are a little bit closer now to the cutaway. The idea is now to get the actual mountain shape and cutaway done. So this is not an exact science. The part of the railway where I'm using to mark off is a little bit raised because of the incline here. So I'm gonna have to mark just a little bit above, but I can always just trim away. And what I wanna do here is make sure that the mountain shape sort of continues down, and then we can maybe cut it like that. Kind of gives us a good idea of where the cutaway might be, which would be somewhere around here, but I'll cut this out first and then from there kind of work on the actual cutaway section. I'm gonna have to do the same on the back piece here. The mountain can't just end up there. If you can see up there, obviously got that bit that I still need to close off, but that's going to be the tunnel as well, and I need to detail that section first. So I'm going to be leaving that open for now, but I'm going to kind of get the structure of this side of the mountain in. So my next job will be to cut this out and then work out exactly where the cutaway is and cut this into pieces. Okay, so I have cut out our piece here, and something that has occurred to me, first of all, as you can see, is very steep there. So I'm going to cut that back a little bit more because I still need the space here to add the rocks. And I'm not actually going to do this side of the cutaway just yet because I want to detail the rocks first, and then I'll be able to do this side separately. But, oh, somebody's just joined us. Hello, Sky. How are you? Come to find out what it is we're doing, huh? Me? Right, so as I was saying, what I need to do here is now sort of section off this area here. I just need enough space, obviously, so trains that are passing through the reverse loop on the inside here can make it through without bumping into anything on the sides of the walls here. So it's probably a ridiculously overly done design, but I have this really thin polystyrene, and what I was thinking of was sort of half mooning it to line up with the sides here and kind of give myself a, you can't really see that at all, a little bit of a barrier between the wall or the inner loop and outer loop. Okay, so I've got my very thin and bendy polystyrene here, and the idea is then to just have that connected to the two pillars here, glued on each side. And as you can see, there's the inner reverse loop under the mountain, and it just kind of breaks off that seam a little bit, and it'll also give the entire thing a bit more structure once I've put it in entirely. So I think that's probably the best way of doing this. I don't often talk to myself while I'm doing this sort of stuff, but I'm trying to make sure that I'm explaining what I'm doing. So you guys let me know if this is all making sense to you as I go. The methods to my madness, and it is madness. But I really do like polystyrene. It's such a rigid thing once it's all set in place, and it gives you such a decent grounding for doing the rest of everything. So I'm a big fan. Cool, so that's in, and I think it's looking pretty cool actually as it stands. Gonna have to do here on this side, just off camera, this one too also needs to come down, and we need to create another similar structure for it. So I'll do that off camera, and when we come back that should all be done and dusted, and we can actually start potentially covering this mountain up. Now the other thing I need to sort of consider at this point is this section here. As you can see, it's very much open and exposed. I'm probably going to put a sheet of styrene over the top of this. I need some support on that side to sort of base it off and bounce it against, because the mountain sort of comes down there on that side of the hill with a cutaway and then a tunnel portal just along that section of track there as it disappears into the mountain. So I still need to figure out exactly what I'm going to do with that. The difficulty is that reaching over to that side of the mountain, I must probably start with the plaster of Paris first. I'm just thinking out loud. I must start for the plaster of Paris there first, because I still have this space to work in, and I can cover the mountain from that point downwards, and then work on this separately because I can still reach all this on this side. Okay, so this is a couple days later. As you can see, things have changed slightly. So obviously I added that reinforcement on the inside of the inner loop, and I've also added a second barrier on the outside. Now this will obviously be built up with rocks as part of my cutaway. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to be building up this side just yet, because obviously I want to detail and paint this side first and then be able to add the second half in a little bit later. So it's important for me to start building up this mountain as it is here. So one of the things that you're going to notice is this looks absolutely chaotic. I realize. I've taken all the scrap pieces of the polystyrene that I've cut off, and I've just chucked them in here. And you may be wondering why you're doing that. Well, for one, it's to bolster the mountain structure. It'll give it a little bit more rigidity when I go on to the next phase, which is to use filler foam to cover this entire thing. The more space I can take up with polystyrene, the less filler foam I have to actually use. I would argue that using filler foam is perhaps one of the more expensive options when it comes to actual landscaping like this. However, the results really do speak for themselves, and with my previous experience with it, I can't see myself doing anything else to create the mountain I want to. Now, if we move around to this side of the mountain, you'll notice that this large gap is still actually here. I'm not going to be filling that in just yet, because I obviously need to still reach the top of that mountain to use my plaster of Paris bandages and make my way down. So I'll be filling this in a little bit later. Obviously, this side of the layout is pretty difficult to work with. So the idea, once I start actually getting onto the scenics and painting, is that the entire layout will come forward, as I think I've probably already mentioned before. The entire layout will come forward so that I can work on the back parts and then push it up back against the wall once the scenic boards are in, and then it should be done. So now what I'm going to do is tape these spines together using just plain old masking tape, just to make sure that they're holding together in the correct position, because once you start using filler foam, obviously it expands, and that might just push them out a little bit, and I want them to still be straight down and rigid so that when I do start putting stuff on top of the mountain, it's still fairly secure and it's not going to crumble under any kind of weight. I know this looks absolutely chaotic, and I know I have no idea what I'm doing, but I think this is the right direction. I'm going to be so careful when... Fortunately, I've managed to make sure that the hole is just enough for me and my skinny frame to get into. Okay, so now we mask this baby up, give it a little bit more rigidity. That looks good. I think I'm pretty happy with how that's all sitting. Maybe just hold down some more paper here. This also does help to just make sure that the brown paper isn't too loose and has some kind of form and structure. Okay, so I'm using, I don't know if you guys get this over in the UK, but I use alkaline filler foam. This stuff's absolutely fantastic, and this is the extra big bottle. So I should get a fair bit of use out of something like this. Now, recently saw Emperor's Path, SBJ was using something like this on his 009 layout, and he seemed to absolutely love it, and I completely agree with him. This stuff is amazing, it expands super well, and it's super easy to cut once it's fully expanded and dried. There's no point in waiting anymore, let's get going. So I'm gonna start at the top here. Now I know this looks like some kind of swamp monster has come and done its business on this mountain. It looks absolutely ridiculous, but you know, once everything goes on, it'll be absolutely fine. I'm gonna move to this side now and we'll cover that. Okay, so a couple of days later, and another can of filler foam. So this was 2 cans. So in total, this cost me about £15 to put together. Probably not the cheapest way to build a mountain, but damn, is it not solid. It's absolutely rock hard at this point, and it really does look quite unsettling in many ways with these trails of like tentacles across the landscape here. So there are a couple things that I need to still work on here, and that is just basically trimming stuff down now, because there are certain points where the foam has sort of overhung, it's going over, and I need to just trim those back a little bit. And then we will get on to Plaster of Paris bandages, and this mountain should almost be done. All right, we have come to the point where we are finally adding Plaster of Paris to our mountainside in an effort to finally start closing it up. So this is a fairly simple process. Now I use the Woodland Scenics Plaster of Paris bandages. You can get them in a roll of about 14 meters, around roughly 20 pounds or so. And I think that is pretty good value for money, because this should, in theory, help me cover this entire mountain. And I had previously used that same roll to cover my entire previous layout. So it goes a long way for what you're getting. Fairly simple. We take the bandages, we dip them in water just for a few seconds, and we can then start layering them onto the layout. So we've got quite a lot to cover. I'm gonna start from the top, work my way down, and hopefully all will go fairly smoothly. So let's get going. Now, unfortunately, I managed to lose a whole bunch of my footage that came with ending off this first mountain. But to give you a bit of a rundown, I essentially covered the rest and that major hole that I've been dealing with wire mesh. This was a much simpler and cheaper solution. This can be picked up at any sort of garden center and molded quite easily. So as you can see here, it kind of completes the mountain. It's nicely rounded off, but it's certainly not quite as stable as the foam solution. However, I did build a brace over this hole, so there is a bit of structure and rigidity here. Now, moving on to the second mountain, I decided to go ahead with this wire mesh solution. And essentially what I did was give the mountain some rough structure with pieces of broken polystyrene that I then glued and stapled into place and then covered in the wire mesh. This gave me a good grounding and some interesting angles and shapes of the mountain to put together. And I must say, while it does look a little bit chaotic too, it actually works quite well. All that remains was for me to plaster this to give it its final shape. Okay, so with my mountains complete now, well, roughly complete, I still obviously need to do the other side of the mountains, but we'll get to that once the layout comes forward entirely. However, I do want to reinforce these mountains, especially on the sections where I've used the wire mesh, simply because it's not all that strong. So what I'm gonna do is I've mixed up a bit of a burnt umber / black paint mix, and I've added quite a bit of Mod Podge into that. And what this is going to do is, first of all, we'll color the mountains, but second of all, it's going to reinforce the mountains a little bit more and make them a little bit more sturdy. So we're going to do that now, paint this entire mountain, well, most of it. Again, I'll leave that section just at the top so that I can tackle it when the entire layout comes forward. So there you have it, we have two rather large mountains. They're fairly solid now and I've rounded them off quite nicely. And the next step will be ballasting the railway as well as putting down some rock detail. So keep an eye out for those if you did enjoy this. I just want to shout out my West Highland supporters. Thank you very much, guys. Your small contributions matter a whole lot to the building of Dunromin and of course this channel. So thank you to Annie, Mystic Brick, Kiln Line, Simon Thompson, 3B Rail, Jersey Bill, Tony from Choberton Junction, Derek L, and James from the Little Western Railway. That's all I have for you this week. Thank you so much for watching again. I really do appreciate it. And if you enjoyed this video, drop me a thumbs up. Until I see you next time, keep your engines fired and stay on track. All the best.